Iran, especially its capital Tehran, is facing an unprecedented water crisis. Tehran has been facing extreme drought for 6 consecutive years, putting more than 10 million people at risk.
Now, the population of the Iranian capital, Tehran, consumes around 3 million cubic meters of water every single day.
Running water, because I have been hearing from a lot of friends and family relatives that their water has been cut off since midnight to 7 a.m.
At 0500 hours on November 8, 2025, the streets of Tehran were quiet. Yet beneath the calm, a city of 10 million was teetering on the edge of catastrophe. For years, water levels across the nation had been declining, but never had the crisis reached the gates of the capital itself. Reservoirs sat at 1% of capacity. Massive hydroelectric dams creaked under strain. The pumps that once delivered clean water to millions now sputtered and failed. Residents carried buckets from distant taps, eyes scanning every trickle, every drop that survived the grid. By morning, the scale of the crisis became visible. Families formed lines stretching for kilometers, waiting for water deliveries that arrived inconsistently, sometimes only once a week. Hospitals reported immediate disruption. Intensive care units shut down as fuel for generators ran out. Dialysis machines powered by electricity grounded themselves silently. Surgeons abandoned scheduled procedures, while sterilization of equipment became impossible. The city, once vibrant and sprawling, now resembled a metropolis under siege, not from bombs, but from the absence of the most basic element: water. This crisis did not emerge overnight. In July 2021, in the oil-rich yet impoverished province of Khuzestan, farmers and villagers took to dried riverbeds, holding their dead livestock. Their message was simple, human, and undeniable: I am thirsty. The regime responded with lethal force. Reports later confirmed multiple deaths, dozens blinded by birdshot. It was a warning to those who dared confront the state over a resource considered sacred to life itself. The message was clear: the cry for water would be met with bullets, but not solutions. By November 2025, the water shortage had escalated to Tehran. President Masoud Pezeshkian, in a historic address on the 6th of November, openly admitted what had long been whispered in government corridors. The capital was approaching Day Zero. The term referred to the point at which taps run dry, reservoirs deplete, and urban life grinds to a halt. Pezeshkian's confession was unprecedented. It revealed a failure not only of infrastructure but of governance. Evacuation plans were no longer theoretical, they were imminent. The domino effect was immediate. Tehran relies on hydroelectric power for 10% of its energy. Dams drained beyond recovery halted production. National grids failed under the strain, plunging neighborhoods into darkness. Outages lasting between 2 and 12 hours became routine. Without electricity, pumping stations stopped. Water no longer reached the taps. People carried containers across urban streets in a 21st century metropolis, yet the flow was a trickle, insufficient for survival. Hospitals became symbols of systemic failure. Generators without fuel sat idle, operating rooms went dark, and emergency services were paralyzed. Without water, infections spread unchecked. Reports from Tehran's medical facilities indicated closures of intensive care units, cancellations of surgical procedures, and staff struggling to keep patients alive. The infrastructure that sustained 10 million people was unraveling in real time, leaving residents exposed to a crisis the state could no longer manage. The roots of this catastrophe were decades in the making. Over 600 dams had been built, the country ranking third globally in sheer number of structures, yet many were constructed without scientific oversight, often to benefit companies linked to the Revolutionary Guards. Rivers were diverted, evaporation increased, and water was redirected to industrial facilities rather than communities. The Gotvan Dam, for example, was placed atop a salt layer, contaminating downstream agricultural land. The result was deliberate depletion of water resources, while fertile land turned barren. This engineered scarcity, combined with environmental stressors, accelerated Tehran's collapse. Groundwater levels dropped, as 70% of the nation's aquifers were consumed over 3 decades. Areas like Rafsanjan experienced subsidence at 30 centimeters per year. Roads cracked, pipelines fractured, buildings tilted. The metropolis was literally sinking under the weight of a depleted underground reservoir. Urban infrastructure became a fragile shell over unstable ground, and every day without water amplified the threat of structural failure. Lake Urmia, once a thriving ecosystem, had shrunk to 5% of its former size. Millions of birds vanished. Agricultural soil turned toxic, and winds carried salt across populated regions. Even if rainfall returned, arable land would remain compromised. Food production collapsed alongside water availability, forcing consideration of mass migration. 10 million residents of Tehran faced a dual crisis. Not only scarcity, but the physical collapse of the city they called home. The regime's internal contradictions magnified the threat. Water diverted to industrial facilities, including steel factories consuming 40% of Isfahan's allocation, highlighted a prioritization of economic and political interests over human survival. Rivers dried to feed factories loyal to the state. Protests were met with lethal force, as in November 2021, when 40 farmers were blinded and at least 100 injured in Isfahan's riverbeds. The seeds of evacuation panic planted years prior had now reached fruition. President Peshkin's admission on November 6th signaled to the population and international observers alike that the crisis was beyond management. Water scarcity was no longer an environmental issue. It was a national security threat. Forced evacuation plans indicated recognition of an existential risk to the capital's 10 million inhabitants. The regime faced the impossible task of balancing internal survival, social order, and infrastructure failure, while millions waited in silence, anticipating the day when taps ran completely dry. The implications extended beyond domestic borders. Approximately 50 to 70 million Iranians, or 70% of the population, risked displacement if urban centers became uninhabitable. Food chains, healthcare, and essential services teetered on the edge. Tehran's crisis represented the convergence of environmental, infrastructural, and political collapse. Hydroelectric dams offline, grids failing, hospitals incapacitated, food and medicine rotting, ground sinking beneath urban centers. The city became a vivid illustration of how decades of corruption, mismanagement, and environmental exploitation can converge into a single, unrelenting humanitarian disaster. By the morning of November 8th, Tehran's streets were no longer merely crowded. They were congested arteries of desperation. Citizens carried jugs, buckets, and any container they could find, queuing at intermittent taps, while city-wide announcements reminded residents that water was a privilege, not a guarantee. The city's pumps, already strained by weeks of reduced reservoir levels, sputtered in unpredictable cycles. The electricity grid, dependent on both hydroelectric and thermal power, faltered in response. A blackout of 4 hours here, 6 hours there, quickly became routine. Without power, mobile networks faltered. Internet connectivity became intermittent, cutting communication lines for families and businesses alike. Hospitals struggled to coordinate care, clinics could not operate, and even emergency alerts sometimes failed to reach the population. One system collapsing into the next. Hospitals told a story of unimaginable strain. Intensive care units, reliant on both water and electricity, closed as fuel reserves for generators depleted. Dialysis machines halted mid-cycle. Surgeries were postponed indefinitely. Sterilization of equipment became impossible. Doctors and nurses worked in silence, improvising solutions that could only delay the inevitable. The crisis revealed the vulnerabilities of urban infrastructure. 30 years of overconsumption and mismanagement meant aquifers had been depleted. The regime's approach to the water crisis had long been marked by mismanagement and corruption. Over 600 dams had been constructed nationwide, ranking Iran third in the world. On paper, this suggested progress, yet most were built without scientific coordination. Projects were designed to enrich contractors connected to political elites rather than sustain water systems. Rivers were diverted, evaporation increased, and natural flows disrupted, creating a web of scarcity. The Gotvand Dam, placed atop a massive salt layer, contaminated the Karun River, destroying millions of hectares of fertile land downstream. The social consequences were evident. Water had become a political and economic weapon. In Isfahan, farmers' protests over diverted river water in November 2021 resulted in mass injuries and permanent blindness for dozens. The regime's response was punitive rather than remedial. Lines for water in Tehran now mirrored the desperation in provincial towns 4 years prior, but on a scale exponentially larger. The very capital of 10 million people was now confronting scarcity firsthand. Lake Urmia, once the largest salt lake in the Middle East, had shrunk to just 5% of its original size. Even if rainfall returned, agricultural recovery was impossible. Food production halted, compounding the humanitarian crisis. Millions of urban residents now faced potential migration, not only due to water scarcity, but also the physical collapse of the land beneath them. President Peshkan's admission was more than a warning. It was a signal of systemic, failure. Evacuation plans for parts of Tehran were no longer hypothetical. The regime recognized that water scarcity and urban subsidence could make continued habitation impossible. Millions of residents were suddenly confronted with the prospect of leaving the city they had called home, not for war or famine, but because the infrastructure sustaining life itself had failed. The physical and social crises converged. Urban power outages disrupted water delivery. Hospitals, schools, and industries closed. Food and medicine spoiled. Traffic congestion worsened as residents queued for water and fuel. Supply chains dependent on electricity and water collapsed. A modern city of 10 million teetered on the edge of total systemic failure, revealing the vulnerabilities inherent in decades of mismanagement. International implications were immediate. Iran's role as a strategic supplier to allies, particularly in military technology, became uncertain. Drones, missiles, and critical components relied upon by foreign partners could no longer be guaranteed. Internal collapse meant resources shifted from external commitments to survival. What was once a reliable conduit for regional influence became an unpredictable variable in geopolitical calculations. The Day Zero scenario was more than metaphorical. Unlike Cape Town in 2018, Tehran faced the combined threats of infrastructure collapse, water scarcity, and urban subsidence simultaneously. Millions of residents, dependent on municipal water systems, now faced rationing so extreme that daily consumption might drop to a fraction of normal levels. Hospitals, industrial centers, and homes became equally vulnerable, illustrating the profound interdependence of urban life. The physical collapse extended beyond immediate water scarcity. As underground aquifers emptied, the ground sank, creating fissures in roads, fracturing pipelines and threatening gas lines. Buildings cracked, some leaning precariously. The combination of water shortage, subsidence, and energy failure created a risk of catastrophic infrastructure failure, one that could extend beyond Tehran to surrounding metropolitan regions. Evacuation, once a contingency plan, became a strategic imperative. Peshkan's warnings acknowledged the impossibility of sustaining urban life without immediate interventions. Social unrest, already evident in other provinces, threatened to escalate exponentially in Tehran. Forced relocation of millions, a logistical nightmare, was now openly considered. Lines of communication, emergency planning, and transportation infrastructure strained under the pressure of a city on the brink. Even as authorities debated evacuation, the population responded with improvisation. Residents dug for water in shallow wells, collected runoff from rooftops, and shared containers among neighbors. Local networks formed spontaneously, attempting to bridge the gap left by state systems. Yet, these efforts were patchwork and insufficient against the scale of crisis looming over 10 million people in the capital. Beyond the immediate humanitarian crisis, Tehran's predicament revealed the deeper failures of governance and resource management. Decades of prioritizing industrial and political interests over human needs created a brittle system. Rivers were diverted to steel plants, consuming 40% of local water. Dams mismanaged or built without environmental consideration, and aquifers drained beyond recovery. Every decision compounded the risk of social unrest and structural collapse. The crisis was not sudden, it was the predictable consequence of deliberate policy. The psychological impact on residents was profound. Lines for water grew longer each day, as families rationed remaining supplies. Anxiety and desperation became part of daily life. The elderly, children, and chronically ill were at heightened risk. Every interruption in electricity or water supply was a reminder of vulnerability, and every crack in the roads or building walls a warning of subsidence. Daily routines became survival operations, measured in liters of water and minutes of electricity. Hospitals, already strained, became epicenters of social collapse. Surgeons worked under flickering emergency lights. Generators, without fuel, could not sustain ventilators or refrigeration for medicine. Intensive care units shut down intermittently. Patients with chronic conditions faced immediate threats to life. In November 2021, farmers protesting dried riverbeds in Isfahan were violently suppressed. Dozens were blinded and hundreds injured. The lesson had been clear. Dissent would be crushed, but the problem would remain unresolved. The same pattern now threatened to play out on a city-wide scale, with Tehran's 10 million residents facing the consequences of systemic neglect and political prioritization of profit over life. Environmental collapse compounded the social crisis. Lake Urmia's death, once a thriving ecosystem, left a salt desert that contaminated surrounding farmland. Toxic dust storms now threatened crop production and air quality. Even with water restored, the soil and environment could not support agriculture. Urban residents were forced to confront a stark reality. The crisis was not temporary, it was structural. Survival depended on either migration or drastic intervention. President Pezeshkian's November 6th admission was unprecedented in its candor. The regime openly acknowledged the city was approaching day zero. Evacuation, rationing, and social disruption were now official policy considerations. This disclosure signaled both the severity of the crisis and the regime's inability to manage it. For the first time, citizens and international observers understood that Tehran's infrastructure and governance were on the verge of systemic failure. The implications for regional geopolitics were immediate. Iran's role as a military supplier, particularly in drones and ballistic missiles, became uncertain. Supply chains could no longer be guaranteed as internal collapse demanded attention. The strategic calculations of allies, including Moscow, faced sudden recalibration. Dependence on Iran as a stable partner was now untenable. A city in chaos, a failing state, and infrastructure crumbling beneath 10 million people created a strategic void. Three potential scenarios emerged. First, controlled evacuation and internal displacement could temporarily mitigate crisis, but would risk social unrest. Second, political concessions might be sought to secure external assistance for water technology, forcing ideological compromises and potentially abandoning strategic allies. Third, continued inaction would likely lead to social uprising and revolution, the physical collapse of regime authority, and the loss of centralized control. Each scenario carried catastrophic consequences. At the core of Tehran's crisis was a fundamental truth. Water scarcity is a national security issue. The regime's mismanagement, corruption, and prioritization of industrial interests over human life had transformed an environmental problem into a political and humanitarian catastrophe. Millions were left without water, hospitals failed, infrastructure collapsed, and the city itself sank beneath depleted aquifers. The crisis revealed the fragility of a system that had relied on coercion rather than sustainable management. For the citizens of Tehran, the immediate challenge was survival. Queues for water stretched for kilometers. Families improvised with every available container. Urban networks formed spontaneously to share scarce resources. Electricity and water outages continued in unpredictable cycles, threatening both life and livelihoods. Hospitals, schools, and businesses operated intermittently or not at all. The city, once a symbol of modernity, had been reduced to a battleground for survival against a fundamental scarcity. For observers in Moscow and beyond, Tehran's crisis represented a strategic shock. The reliance of foreign allies on Iranian military production became precarious. Factories producing drones and missiles could no longer guarantee output, while the capital's infrastructure collapsed. Social unrest and forced migration diverted attention inward, destabilizing plans for external engagements. A failing state, once a critical partner, had become a liability. Ultimately, Tehran's crisis demonstrated the intertwined nature of environmental, infrastructural, and political collapse. Decades of mismanagement created brittle systems. Dams diverted water, aquifers were drained, and industrial interests were prioritized over human survival. As water disappeared, so did electricity, food supply, medical care, and governance control. The city faced an unprecedented convergence of humanitarian disaster, social unrest, and structural collapse. The unfolding catastrophe underscored that natural resources are inseparable from governance. A city of 10 million cannot survive without sustainable water, energy, and infrastructure management. Mismanagement over decades, compounded by environmental stress, corruption, and punitive social policies, had created a perfect storm. Tehran faced day zero, not only as a water crisis, but as a broader symbol of systemic failure. In conclusion, the events in Tehran in November 2025 revealed the full spectrum of risks posed by water scarcity combined with infrastructural neglect. Millions without water, hospitals incapacitated, urban subsidence, and social unrest highlighted the consequences of decades of policy failures. Evacuation plans and rationing measures, while necessary, could not mitigate the broader systemic collapse. The city's plight served as a stark warning of the human and strategic costs of mismanaged resources.